market. So when we look at labor market, it's a very important topic because it's frequently tested in the CIE exams, and also you are expected to at least have one essay question coming from it. So, and it's a standalone chapter, which makes it like a chapter that one should completely prepare for, and it then basically reduces the pressure on us because if you are looking at all of the essay questions, you will have much more choice if labor market is one essay question you are planning to sort of attempt. So let's start with labor market. The way I'm going to go with labor market, like just like any other market, when you look at labor market, right, we will look at its demand, we will look at its supply, and then once we know both of this, we look at equilibrium. So we look at it like a free market where there's no government and all that. We look at demand supply. We also look at elasticity here, in the labor markets demand for both demand and supply. So we look at elasticity discussion. And then we look at later on, once we have this sorted in terms of equilibrium, we look at basically other scenarios where, like how does market, imperfection happens. And market imperfection basically means how does market not allowed to operate freely. For example, sometimes there could be government intervention that can happen, or sometimes there could be like trade unions that can happen, so other forces which are not the market forces that can affect equilibrium. So we look at that also, and then we talk about like how are wages determined. So there are two things that we look at is wage determination. Okay, and then we look at, once we're done with wage determination, we look at wage differential, which is why are some people paid more than the other. Like if you look at within the same, for example, football team, if you have Messi in a good football team, in for example Barcelona, you might have other players in the same team but paid less than Messi. And what could be a possible reason for such a difference of wages? That's something which we discussed here. So this topic will take probably this week for us to finish. It's not that long of a topic, unlike market structures, but an essential topic nonetheless. Okay, so let's start, guys. So first thing we'll look at is what we call demand for labor. What do we mean by demand for labor? So who is demanding labor? And the answer is firms are demanding labor, right? Why are firms demanding labor? Because they want to make output. Isn't that true? So firms are demanding labor because they want to make output. In a way, can I say this? Labor is what we call a derived demand. It's derived from the demand of the good or service. So, for example, if I want to demand more cars, I may demand more labor that makes that car. So, demand for labor is kind of demanded because labor is demanded because the product that the labor makes is demanded. So, we say this that there is a link between the quantity of labor that a firm employs and the quantity of output it plans to produce. More output means more labor. So a consequence of this link is that firm's demand curve is the flip side of supply of its output. So when the quantity supply is going up for the firm in terms of output, the demand for labor may go up. Okay, so that's something which is an important thing to understand from the perspective that when you look at demand for labor, it's a derived demand because it's derived from the product that the labor makes. Makes sense? We will first understand the idea of uh, profit maximization in this market. Remember, when we look at profit maximization in the normal circumstances, when we look at profit maximization from a firm's perspective, we know MC is equal to MR, right? Now, if I ask you what is the profit maximizing level of employment, okay, let me write this question. What is the profit maximizing level of employment? How do we find that out? Because we know MC equals to MR is when this is a profit uh, maximizing level of output, right? But how do we figure out profit maximizing level of employment? Like, for example, if I hire a labor, uh, I want to make sure that I hire a labor in a manner that my profit is maximized. I don't want to hire a labor that ends up lowering my profit. Does that make sense? You want to hire a labor in order to increase your profit or maximize your profit, right? So, what exactly do we need to understand is basically the benefit of hiring labor. I want to understand, first of all, the benefit of hiring labor, right? And I want to understand, after benefit, I want to understand the cost of hiring labor. Are you all with me? Because the benefit of hiring labor will make me understand, okay, where do I maximize my benefit versus also where do I maximize my sort of minimize my cost? And I want to make sure that the extra benefit, the marginal benefit, should be equal to the marginal cost. So it should be equal to marginal cost. So marginal benefit of hiring should be equal to marginal cost of hiring. And if that is the case, then I'm maximizing my profit. Okay. So let's look at the benefit of hiring labor, or what we call marginal benefit of hiring labor. Are you guys with me? Does that make sense? Any questions before we move on? Any questions, guys? Okay, so let's look at what is the benefit of hiring labor. And the answer to this one is the benefit of hiring labor, guys, is to do with something called marginal revenue product, or MRP. So, what is MRP? MRP, we say, is basically the extra revenue from hiring one extra worker. So we say this MRP is the extra revenue from hiring one extra worker, and that is equal to two things. Number one is MR times MP. And I want to explain this concept, an important concept, that what benefit that you get when you hire one extra worker. We say a worker contributes to your revenue in two ways. Number one, when you hire a worker, he will give you extra output. So this is your extra output from an additional worker, right? And you then compare that with your MR, which is your extra sort of revenue from one extra unit of output. For does that make sense, guys? So I'm saying this, that the benefit that you get from hiring an extra worker is actually a product of MP times MR. What do we mean by this? And I want to explain this in terms of example. Let's say if you hire a worker and he produced 10 bats, okay, and each bat is sold for um, $20. So how much revenue did he give you when you hired this worker? And the answer is your extra MP is 10 times the revenue that you get from an extra unit of output is basically $20 per bat, right? So that would mean the worker is giving you how much, guys? What's the revenue this guy gives you when you hire him? Anyone? What's the revenue that you give him? $200. So $200 will be the extra revenue from hiring the extra worker. Are we good? Does that make sense? Are you all with me, guys? So when you hire a worker, he gives you an extra output. And also, this output can then be sold in the market for a particular price. So what's the benefit of hiring an extra worker? And that we say is MRP, which is going to be MR times MP. Make sense? Are you all with me? I can repeat the bat part. Let's say, Zamin, a bat is for $20, right? So this is the price of a bat. This price is also called the marginal revenue because that's the extra revenue that I get from selling a bat. And the extra output MP that you get from hiring a worker, let's say, is 10. If the extra output is 10, so 10 times 20 means the guy can give you $200 of revenue. Now, when you are paying him a salary, guys, will you pay him a salary of will you pay him a salary more than $200? Anyone? Will you pay him a salary of more than $200? And the answer is no. No, I won't. And the reason is simple, because if he's giving you 200 in terms of revenue, then you should pay him 200 or less, but not more. Because if you pay him more than 200, guys, then you will end up in a situation where your revenue is basically going to be less than the cost of hiring the labor. So the cost of hiring the labor, the marginal cost of hiring the labor, is the wage rate we pay. Isn't that true? What's the marginal cost of hiring labor? Therefore, the wage rate you pay. So you can never pay a worker less than you can never pay a worker a more than the benefit that he's giving you if you want to maximize profits. Make sense? So marginal cost, marginal revenue product must be greater than or equal to marginal cost. Are you all with me? Does that make sense? Are we good? So that's something which we need to understand this. Now, guys, a couple of things that I want to talk about before, because we want to also see this in terms of a diagram. So let's visualize this concept in terms of a diagram, because it's going to be useful to understand how does it look like. So we know this, guys, that in perfect competition, if you go back to perfect competition, we learn this that competition, we learn this that price is always equal to MR. Remember, the demand curve in perfect competition is like this, right? So price is always equal to MR. So I can rewrite my MRP equation. My MRP equation can be MP times MR, but since price is equal to MR, I can say this that in perfect competition, PC for perfect competition, MRP will be equal to MP times P. You guys get that? Does that make sense? Only in perfect competition you will say this MRP is equal to MP times P. Are we good? Any questions, guys? Okay, awesome. So perfect competition, guys, MRP must be equal to MP times P. But otherwise, in any other market structure, we won't see that to happen. Now, also one more thing we need to understand this as we move on. So in perfect competition, we say MRP is equal to MP times P, which means I can see this in a diagram also, because in perfect competition, my MP curve, remember from our older discussion in which was doing, like when we're doing the cost chapter, your MP is like this, your quantity of labor is like this, and we said that my MP looks like this, right? Do you guys remember this? MP looks like this. In the short run, MP rises and MP falls. And MP, when MP falls, why does MP fall? Anyone? Does MP fall after a certain amount of labor hired? Why does MP fall? Anyone? Do we remember this discussion? Exactly, Zaman. Good job. Because of the law of diminishing return. The law of diminishing return says this that as we keep on hiring more labor, in the short run, MP starts to fall. Make sense? Do you guys remember this? Yeah, capital to labor ratio, basically the law of diminishing return. Good job, guys. So MP falls because of law of diminishing return. And if demand curve, guys, if demand curve is like this, if your demand curve is like this, my demand is my equal to my MR, right? So this is my demand curve. So this is my price and quantity. Then this times this, right? Which by the way, MR is equal to P. This times this will be my MRP. Are you all with me? So MP times P is my MRP. That's what I'm saying. So if I ask you guys, how will my MRP look like? And let's assume, guys, the price is $20. Okay. The price is $20. What do you guys think will be the shape of MRP? Any guesses? Same, very good job, Ashwak. Very good job. Same as MP. Because this times 20 means I'm just changing the scale of this. So my MRP, guys, in terms of a diagram, in perfect competition is going to look like this. Does that make sense, guys? So in my perfect competition, it's going to look similar to, I'm just going to call it MRP. It's going to be MP times 20. So the scale will change, same as MP. Exactly, guys. So MRP will be in dollars, right? And this is your quantity of labor. By the way, this is quantity of output. We know this. So as you hire more labor, you may see MRP to fall. So there's a very popular exam question that comes in MCQs, which says this, that why is MRP downward sloping? Okay, why is MRP downward sloping, guys? Any guesses? Why is MRP downward sloping? Anyone? No. Why does MRP fall? Not because of, very good, Ashwak, because of the law of diminishing, exactly, because of a law of diminishing returns. Are you all with me? And because MP falls, MRP falls. It's not the reason because price is falling. Yet this is flat. It's because MP falls that MRP falls. So good job, guys. Whoever said law of diminishing return, because it's the law of diminishing return which makes MP fall, and it's because of law of diminishing, because of MP falling, MRP falls. Do you get it? Does that make sense? Are we good? Questions, guys? Any questions? So this is how my MRP looks like in perfect competition. But there's a question that somebody asks you, okay, in perfect competition, MRP is equal to MP times P, right? But what happens in imperfect competition? Remember, guys, in imperfect competition, so in imperfect competition, like for example, what if the product market is, what if the product market is monopoly? What will my MRP look like? That's also a question that comes in exam. And we know this, that in imperfect competition, guys, your thing that is different is your demand curve. Your demand curve is like this, right? Downward sloping demand curve, which is equal to price, which is equal to AR, right? And your MR is like this. MR is like this. So this is my quantity and price. And so why is, if I ask you guys, why is MRP downward sloping in monopoly or imperfect competition? What will be your answer, guys? Anyone? What will be your answer for this one? And this comes, by the way, in MCQs as well. So why is MRP downward sloping in imperfect competition? And the answer for this one will be No, not prices decreasing. Law of diminishing return, as well as Ashwak, listen, two things. One is because MP will always be like this, guys. So one is because MP is falling, and also second is because MR is also falling. So the answer is because both MP and MR falls as quantity rises. Your either your MP also, MP by the way, MP का shape same रहता है. So I'm going to copy this diagram. If I copy this diagram, guys, I'm just going to copy this diagram and I'm going to bring it here. My MP will look like this only. Okay, so if I just my MP is like this. So not only my MP falls, right? Just to zoom it a little bit more. Not only my MP falls, but my MR also falls. So both components are falling. MP is falling and MR is falling. Are you all with me, guys? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Any questions? So this is an important discussion to understand that in an imperfect market, like a labor market, which has a monopoly producer, you may have a both MP falling and MR falling, and that's why it's a downward sloping demand curve. So in terms of discussion, guys, if you look at it, we're done with this page, and we're done with this page. We're done with this diagram, and now I'm going to talk about something called profit maximization, because we want to talk about profit maximization. So let's talk about this diagram. So uh, what do we mean by profit maximization in this context that we're discussing? So profit maximization basically means, now in the labor market context, MRP, which is the revenue that we get from hiring one extra worker, must be equal to marginal cost. And I'm saying, why is MRP must be equal to MC? Because MRP is the extra benefit of hiring one extra worker, and I'm comparing that to my extra cost of hiring one additional worker. Make sense? Are we good? Are we good with this? So extra revenue must be equal to extra cost. Now, how do we show that in terms of a diagram? We know this. I'm going to stick with perfect competition. So let's say perfect competition. And I will, because we will do all the other cases later. In perfect competition, guys, uh, we actually argue this, that if you look at perfect competition, your MRP looks like this. Okay, let me change the color of this to green. Sorry, purple. So in perfect competition, your MRP looks like this, which is MP times P. So this is my quantity of labor. This is my MRP in terms of dollar. Okay. So my MRP looks like this. But what about my marginal cost of hiring a worker? And let's assume our marginal cost is like this. And I'll give you an example of what do we mean by that. And let's say the wage is, like, say, $20 per hour. So if you are looking at a market that could be very close to perfectly competitive sort of labor market, and this, by the way, wage is my supply, which is also my marginal cost. So if you look at a perfectly competitive labor market, the example that comes to us of a competitive labor market is something which is Like if I'm working for example, McDonald's, or if I'm working for example, Dunkin' Donuts, or if I'm working for example, any shop that requires uh, a cash teller, right? So the guy who manages your cash behind the teller is basically a guy who is in probably being hired in a perfectly competitive setting. He may charge $20 per hour, right? And you can have as many of these tellers as possible depending on what your demand is. So from a first firm's perspective, if he hire one guy, he's going to pay them $20. If he hires two guys, he will still have to pay $20 because that's a market going wage rate. So $20 wage of $20 is what we call market going wage rate. Okay, and at that wage rate, the cost of hiring an additional worker doesn't change because you can keep on hiring as many workers as possible. But how many will you hire depends on your MRP. And if your MRP is like this, then MC equals to MRP will happen at, for example, Q1. Now, what is happening before Q1 versus after Q1? Is that something which I want to talk about before we end today's class? Is that before Q1, I will say MRP is greater than MC. After Q1, MRP is less than MC. And at Q1, MRP is equal to MC. So before Q1, I can say this that the benefit of hiring an extra worker is more than the cost. Isn't that true? If the benefit of by hiring an extra worker or revenue from hiring an extra worker is more than the extra cost, can I say this, guys? Can I say this that the marginal profit is positive when the extra revenue is more than the extra cost? Can I say this, guys? The marginal profit is positive. Do you all agree with me? Similarly, MRP is less than MC, marginal profit is negative. Why is it negative? And the answer is simple because extra revenue is is less than the extra cost. So your profit will extra profit will go down, will become negative. So whenever marginal profit is positive, what happens to total profit? Zamin or Ashfaq, what happens to total profit when your marginal profit is positive? Marginal profit will be when if marginal profit is positive, your total profit will rise. Isn't that true? When marginal profit is negative, your total profit will fall. And that would mean as long as you keep on producing and your marginal profit is positive, you will make your total profit go up. And therefore, after Q1, total profit will go down, which means at Q1, your total profit is maximum. Do you guys get that? Do you all agree with me? Are we good, guys? So that's basically the idea of profit maximization, that when the firm is hiring an extra worker, it looks at the extra cost versus extra revenue. If the extra revenue is more than extra cost, he will always hire the worker because that worker is going to make the total profit of the firm to go up because he contributes more to revenue than to cost. But if you look beyond Q1, the extra benefit is less than extra cost, which would mean you should not hire this worker because total profit will fall. Which means you should stop at Q1 where marginal revenue product is equal to marginal cost. The extra benefit is equal to extra cost because before that the contribution or the margin from the contribution margin from the labor was positive and then became negative, which means at this point it will be maximum. Okay, does that make sense, guys? Are we good? So this is the discussion for today. Do you have any questions? Please ask me, guys.